My daughter-in-law slammed an $8,000 bill on the table and screamed with rage, "It's over! Either you pay this or you're both going to a nursing home." Then my husband, who had been silent, slowly rose to his feet, adjusted his suit, and stared deep into our son's eyes, his own filled with sorrow. No one could have predicted what happened next. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Ada, and at 61 years old, I never imagined I would be sitting at my own kitchen table, watching my daughter-in-law slam an $8,000 bill down in front of me like I was some kind of debtor who had defaulted on a loan. The sound of the paper hitting the wooden surface echoed through our small dining room, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Emery stood there, her perfectly manicured hands still pressed against the document, her face twisted with a rage I had never seen before, not even during her worst moments over the past 2 years. "It's over!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the afternoon silence like a knife. "Either you pay this, or you're both going to a nursing home." I stared at the bill, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on the numbers. It was from some medical billing company I had never heard of, dated just last week, with charges that made no sense to me. Emergency room visits, specialist consultations, procedures I couldn't remember having. My throat felt dry as I looked up at Emery, whose green eyes were blazing with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What is this for?" Emery let out a harsh laugh, the kind that held no humor whatsoever. "Don't play dumb with me, Ada. These are your medical bills, the ones you've been hiding from us. The ones that are bankrupting my family because you're too selfish to take responsibility for your own health." I felt the blood drain from my face. I had been to the doctor recently, yes, but nothing that would cost anywhere near $8,000. A routine checkup, some blood work, nothing more. I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could speak, Harold cleared his throat. My husband had been sitting quietly in his chair at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded in front of him, his gray eyes fixed on something beyond the window. He had barely said a word since Emery arrived an hour ago, just listened as she ranted about expenses and responsibilities, and how we were becoming too much of a burden for Randall and her to handle. Now, Harold slowly rose to his feet. At 73, he moved with deliberate care, his tall frame unfolding with a dignity that seemed to fill the room. He adjusted his navy blue cardigan, the one I had knitted for him 3 Christmases ago, and then he turned to look at our son. Randall was standing by the kitchen counter, his arms crossed, his face a mask of discomfort and guilt. He wouldn't meet his father's eyes, just stared at the floor like he had when he was 12 years old and had broken Mrs. Henderson's window with his baseball. Harold's gaze was steady, unwavering, but I could see something in his expression that made my chest tighten with worry. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly disappointment there. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. "Son," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of wisdom and experience. "Look at me." Randall's head jerked up, and for a moment, our 35-year-old son looked exactly like the little boy who used to run into our bedroom during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and protection. But there was no storm outside today, just the toxic atmosphere that Emery had brought into our home. "Is this really what you want?" Harold asked, his voice so soft I had to strain to hear him. "Is this really the man you've decided to become?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood where Randall had grown up, where we had raised him with love and sacrifice, and the hope that he would become someone we could be proud of. Emery's face flushed red. "Don't you dare try to guilt-trip him," she snapped at Harold. "We've been supporting you two for months now. The groceries, the utilities, the house repairs. We can't keep hemorrhaging money because you're too proud to admit you need professional care." I felt tears stinging my eyes. It was true that Randall had been helping us financially since Harold's retirement benefits had been cut last year. The company he had worked for 37 years had filed for bankruptcy, taking most of his pension with it. We had struggled to make ends meet. and our son had stepped in without being asked, just as we had taught him to do. But professional care? A nursing home? The very thought made my stomach turn. I had visited enough of those places when my own mother was dying to know what they were really like. The smell of disinfectant that never quite masked the odor of human decay, the empty stares of residents parked in wheelchairs facing television screens they couldn't really see, the overworked staff who treated people like problems to be managed rather than human beings deserving of dignity. "We're not ready for that," I said, finding my voice at last. "We're still independent. We just need a little help sometimes." Emery whirled around to face me, her blonde hair whipping across her shoulders. "Independent? You call this independent? Your husband can barely walk up the stairs without getting winded, and you've been having memory issues for months." "I have not," I protested. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. There had been moments lately where I had walked into a room and forgotten why I was there. Times when I had struggled to remember the name of a neighbor I had known for 15 years. I had chalked it up to stress and getting older, nothing more. Harold moved then, stepping around the table with slow, measured steps until he was standing directly in front of Randall. They were almost the same height now, my son having inherited his father's tall, lean build, but Harold still seemed to tower over him with the quiet authority he had always possessed. "Randall," Harold said, and his voice was different now, carrying a weight I had never heard before. "Before you make any decisions about your mother and me, there are some things you need to know. Things I've been keeping to myself because I wanted to see what kind of man you really are." Randall's face went pale. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Harold reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. I had seen him writing in it sometimes over the past few months, usually late at night when he thought I was asleep. When I had asked him about it, he had simply said he was keeping track of things, nothing important. "This," Harold said, holding up the notebook, "contains every conversation, every demand, every threat your wife has made over the past 6 months. It contains dates, times, and details that I think you might find very interesting." Emery's confident expression faltered for just a moment, so quickly I almost missed it. But I saw the flash of panic in her eyes before she regained her composure. "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier force. "You're just trying to create problems where none exist." Harold opened the notebook and flipped through several pages, his finger tracing lines of his careful handwriting. "March 15th, he read aloud. "Emery tells Ada that if she doesn't stop taking her heart medication, the family will save money on medical bills. March 22nd, Emery suggests that Ada's confusion might be an act to get attention." My blood ran cold. I remembered those conversations, but I had convinced myself I was being oversensitive, that I was misunderstanding Emery's intentions. Harold had been there for the first one, but I thought he hadn't heard. I had said nothing about the second. "Dad," Randall said, his voice strained. "What are you saying?" Harold closed the notebook and looked at his son with eyes that held decades of love and disappointment. "I'm saying that your mother and I have been living in fear for months. Fear of your wife, fear of losing our home, fear of what tomorrow might bring. And I'm saying that this bill," he gestured to the document still lying on the table, "is just the latest in a long line of lies." The room erupted. Emery began shouting, demanding to know how Harold dared to call her a liar, insisting that everything she had done was for the good of the family. Randall was trying to calm her down while simultaneously questioning his father, his voice rising with confusion and anger. But I was staring at Harold, really seeing him for the first time in months. My husband, who I had thought was simply enduring our situation with quiet resignation, had been watching, listening, documenting everything. The man who had built our life together with steady hands and unwavering patience had been protecting us in the only way he could think of. And as I looked into his eyes, I saw something that made my heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. Harold had a plan, and whatever it was, I had the feeling that nothing would ever be the same after today. I hadn't always been afraid of my daughter-in-law. In fact, when Randall first brought Emery home 5 years ago, I had been thrilled. She was beautiful, articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in our family. She asked thoughtful questions about Randall's childhood, complimented my cooking, and even helped with the dishes without being asked. "She's perfect," I had whispered to Harold that night as we lay in bed after her first visit. "She really loves him." Harold had made a non-committal sound, the kind he made when he was thinking but not ready to share his thoughts. I should have paid more attention to that sound. The changes started small, so gradual that I didn't notice them at first. Emery would make little suggestions about how we could improve our home, innocent observations that somehow made me feel inadequate. "This wallpaper is so vintage," she would say with a bright smile. "You know, with a little updating, this place could be really charming." She began arriving for visits with cleaning supplies, insisting that she wanted to help, that it wasn't any trouble at all. But her help came with commentary. "Oh my, when was the last time anyone cleaned behind this refrigerator?" Or, "Harold, you really should be more careful about tracking mud through the house." Harold would watch these interactions with growing tension in his jaw, but he never said anything directly. When I tried to talk to him about it, he would simply nod and say that Emery was trying to be helpful, that we should give her time to settle into the family. The isolation began about 2 years into their marriage. Suddenly, Emery had opinions about everything. She thought our weekly dinners with the Kowalskis next door were too much socializing for people your age. She worried that our participation in the church bake sale was too stressful and might affect our health. One by one, our social connections began to fray as Emery found reasons why each activity was inappropriate or dangerous for us. "She's just concerned about us," I would tell myself, even as I found myself making excuses to old friends about why we couldn't meet for coffee anymore, why we had to leave church immediately after service instead of staying for fellowship. But it was the medical issues that really began to worry me. Emery seemed to know an awful lot about our health for someone who wasn't a doctor. She would point out symptoms I hadn't noticed, suggest that my occasional forgetfulness might be early dementia, worry aloud about Harold's shortness of breath after climbing stairs. "You really should see a specialist," she would say with such genuine concern in her voice. "I've been reading about cognitive decline in women your age, and the early signs can be so subtle. You might not even realize it's happening." These conversations always left me feeling anxious and confused. Was I becoming forgetful? Was Harold's breathing getting worse? I began second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if my perceptions were reliable, if I was becoming the burden Emery seemed to think I was. The financial pressure started about 8 months ago. Emery began bringing up money during every visit, always framed as concern for our well-being. She would sit at our kitchen table with her laptop, showing us articles about the rising costs of healthcare for seniors, the astronomical expenses of long-term care, the importance of planning ahead. "I just want to make sure you're prepared," she would say, her voice filled with loving concern. "Randall and I love you both so much, and we want to help, but we have to be realistic about what we can afford." She began keeping track of everything, every grocery store receipt, every utility bill, every medical expense. She created spreadsheets showing how much our monthly costs had increased over the past year, charts demonstrating how our fixed income was failing to keep pace with inflation. "Look at this," she would say, pointing to her meticulously organized data. "Your prescription costs alone have gone up 30% since last year. And these house repairs, Harold, you really can't keep putting them off. The furnace is going to fail completely if you don't replace it soon." The numbers were overwhelming, impossible to argue with. Emery presented them with such professional competence, such obvious expertise in financial matters, that I felt foolish questioning her conclusions. When she suggested that we might need to consider alternative living arrangements, it seemed like the logical result of an impossible situation rather than the manipulation I now realized it was. Harold had tried to resist in his quiet way. "We'll manage," he would say. "We always have." But Emery had an answer for everything. "Harold, you're being unrealistic. What happens if one of you falls and breaks a hip? What happens if Ada's memory problems get worse? You can't just hope everything will work out." She began bringing pamphlets from assisted living facilities, expensive brochures featuring smiling seniors in perfectly manicured gardens. "These places aren't like the nursing homes you're thinking of," she would explain. "They're communities. Look how happy everyone looks." The brochures stayed on our coffee table for weeks, a constant reminder of our supposed inadequacy, our failure to plan properly for our golden years. I would find myself staring at the pictures of those smiling faces, wondering if they were truly happy or if they were just putting on an act for the camera. It was Harold who first noticed the inconsistencies. Little things, like medical appointments Emery claimed I had missed that I was certain I had never scheduled, bills for services I couldn't remember receiving, conversations about my health that Emery reported to Randall but that I couldn't recall having. "Are you sure you told her about your dizzy spells last Tuesday?" Harold would ask quietly after Emery had left. I would search my memory, replaying the conversation, but I couldn't find any mention of dizzy spells. In fact, I hadn't had any dizzy spells at all lately. But Emery's concern had been so genuine, so detailed, that I began to doubt my own recollection. Maybe I mentioned it and forgot, I would say, but Harold would give me that look again, the one that meant he was thinking but not ready to share his thoughts. 3 months ago, Harold started carrying that little notebook. He would write in it after Emery's visits, late at night when the house was quiet. When I asked him about it, he would say he was keeping track of things, nothing important, but I began to notice that he was paying attention in a way he hadn't before. When Emery spoke, Harold listened with a focus that seemed almost intense. He would ask quiet questions, simple clarifications that seemed innocent, but somehow made Emery defensive. "What was the name of that specialist again?" he would ask. "The one Ada saw last month?" "Why does it matter?" Emery would snap. "The important thing is the diagnosis." "Of course," Harold would say mildly. "I just like to keep track of these things." I could see that his questions made her uncomfortable, though I couldn't understand why. If everything was as she said, why wouldn't she want us to have all the details? Why did she seem so reluctant to provide the specific information that Harold requested? Last month, Harold had asked me to start saving all my medical documents. "Just put them in this box," he said, giving me an old shoebox from the closet. "Don't mention it to anyone." The request seemed strange, but I did as he asked. Bills, appointment summaries, test results, everything went into the box. It wasn't until I started collecting them that I realized how many of the charges Emery had attributed to me were for services I had never received, appointments I had never attended, procedures I couldn't remember having. When I tried to discuss this with Harold, he would nod thoughtfully but ask me not to say anything to Randall or Emery yet. "I need to understand what's happening first," he would say, "before we make any accusations." But sitting here now, watching my husband confront our son with that notebook in his hand, I realized that Harold had understood much more than he had let on. While I had been doubting myself, questioning my memory and my perceptions, Harold had been quietly documenting the truth. The bill Emery had slammed on the table wasn't the first impossible charge she had presented us with. It was just the largest, the most threatening, the final piece of evidence Harold needed to prove what he had suspected all along. My hands were shaking as I reached for the $8,000 bill, reading through the charges with new eyes. Emergency room visit for chest pain on a day I had spent the entire afternoon gardening. Specialist consultation for memory problems on a date I had been visiting my sister in the next town. Procedure after procedure that I not only hadn't received, but couldn't have received given where I had actually been on those dates. As the truth began to dawn on me, I felt a mixture of relief and rage that threatened to overwhelm me. Relief because I wasn't losing my mind. My memory wasn't failing. I wasn't becoming the burden Emery had convinced me I was becoming. But rage because this woman, this person we had welcomed into our family, had been systematically destroying our sense of reality for her own purposes. I looked up to find Harold watching me, and I saw in his eyes that he knew I was finally seeing what he had been seeing for months. My husband, my partner of 42 years, had been protecting me in the only way he could, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And that moment was now. Harold opened the notebook again, this time turning to a page near the beginning. His fingers, weathered from decades of honest work, traced the lines of careful handwriting as if he were reading scripture. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Emery's rapid breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "January 7th, Harold read, his voice steady and clear. Emery tells Randall that Ada had an episode of confusion at the grocery store, claiming she forgot where she parked and wandered around the parking lot for 30 minutes before asking for help. I felt my stomach clench. I remembered that day perfectly. I had gone to the store with Emery, and yes, I had momentarily forgotten where we parked. But it had taken me less than 2 minutes to find the car. Emery had laughed about it at the time, saying it happened to everyone. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Harold nodded. January 15th, Emery tells me privately that Ada has been having trouble remembering to take her medications, suggesting we might need to consider a pill organizer or professional supervision. "I never missed my medications," I said, louder this time. "I take them every morning with breakfast, just like I have for years." Randall was staring at his father with growing confusion. "Dad, what are you saying? That Emery was lying about Mom's condition?" Harold flipped forward several pages. February 3rd, Emery shows Randall a bill for $237 from Dr. Morrison's office, claiming it was for a memory evaluation that revealed early signs of dementia. My breath caught in my throat. I never saw Dr. Morrison for a memory evaluation. I saw him for my annual physical, and he said my cognitive function was perfectly normal for my age. Emery's face had gone white, but she rallied quickly. "You're confused, Ada. You're proving my point right now. You can't even remember your own medical appointments." But Harold was ready for this. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. From it, he extracted several documents. "These are copies of all of Ada's actual medical records from the past year, which I requested directly from each doctor's office." He laid them out on the table like playing cards, each one a small piece of evidence that would destroy the narrative Emery had so carefully constructed. Dr. Morrison's notes from February 3rd indicate a routine physical examination with normal cognitive screening results. There is no mention of dementia concerns, no referral for further evaluation, and certainly no recommendation for assisted living placement. Randall leaned forward, squinting at the medical records. I could see his face changing as he read, confusion giving way to something that looked like dawning horror. "But the bill," Emery said, her voice rising with panic. "The bill clearly shows charges for cognitive testing." Harold pulled out another document. "This is a statement from Dr. Morrison's billing department, confirming that no such charges were ever made to Ada's account. The bill you showed us was fabricated." The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Fabricated. My daughter-in-law had created fake medical bills, invented symptoms, lied about my condition to my own son. The enormity of it was staggering. "This is insane," Emery said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Why would I do something like that? What would I have to gain?" Harold turned to another page in his notebook. "March 20th. You tell Randall that our monthly expenses have increased to the point where we need $1,700 per month to stay in our home. You suggest that assisted living would actually be more economical." "Our expenses have increased," Emery protested. "That's not a lie." "No," Harold agreed, "but the reasons you gave were." He pulled out a stack of receipts and bills from the envelope. "These are our actual monthly expenses, which I've been tracking carefully. Our basic living costs are $850 per month, not $1,700. Randall was studying the documents with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that would determine his own fate. "But what about all these medical bills? The prescription costs? The home repairs?" Harold spread out more papers. "The prescription cost you were shown included medications that Ada doesn't take and procedures that never happened. The home repair estimates came from companies that quoted prices for work we never requested." I watched my son's face as he processed this information. It was like watching someone wake up from a long, complicated dream, the kind where reality and fantasy are so intertwined that it takes time to separate them. "The furnace repair estimate for $3,000, Harold continued, was for replacing a unit in a house twice the size of ours. The roof repair quote for $5,000 was for a complete replacement, not the minor patchwork we actually need." Emery was backing away from the table now, her confident facade cracking like paint on an old wall. You're twisting everything, she said. You're making it sound like I was trying to deceive you, but I was just trying to help you plan for the future. By lying about my wife's medical condition, Harold's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. By creating fake bills, by isolating us from our friends and community, by convincing our son that his parents were becoming incompetent burdens who needed to be managed like children. Randall stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. He looked like a man who had just discovered that his entire understanding of reality was built on quicksand. I don't understand. Why would you do this? What did you want? For the first time since this confrontation began, Emery was silent. She stood there, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between Harold's evidence and Randall's face like she was calculating whether there was any way to salvage the situation. Harold answered the question for her. Control, he said simply. She wanted control over our assets, our decisions, our lives. And she was using you, Randall, to get it. He turned to another section of the notebook. April 10th. Emery suggests that we should consider giving you power of attorney so you could handle our finances more efficiently. April 18th. She brings up the idea of us signing over the deed to the house so it would be protected if we needed Medicaid coverage for nursing home care. I felt sick. These were conversations I remembered, presented to us as loving suggestions from a daughter-in-law who cared about our security and wanted to protect our assets. I had been grateful for her financial expertise, impressed by her knowledge of elder care planning. May 2nd, Harold continued. Emery tells you that we've agreed to these arrangements and asks when we can meet with a lawyer to finalize the paperwork. But we never agreed to anything, I said, finding my voice at last. We never even discussed it seriously. Randall was staring at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly anger there. It was something deeper, something that looked like betrayal and disbelief, and the terrible realization that the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically lying to you. Emery, he said, and his voice was hoarse. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me there's some explanation I'm not seeing. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For a moment I thought she might confess, might break down and admit what she had done and beg for forgiveness. But instead, she did what she had been doing all along. She attacked. You're going to believe him over me? She said, her voice rising to a near shriek. Your own wife? He's clearly manipulating these documents, making everything sound worse than it is, because he can't stand the idea that his precious son might love someone more than he loves his parents. But Harold was ready for this too. He reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a small digital recorder. 3 days ago, he said, setting the device on the table. You came here while Randall was at work. You thought Ada was napping, but she was in the bathroom, and I was in the kitchen where you couldn't see me. He pressed play, and suddenly the room was filled with Emery's voice, clear and unmistakable. Listen, Harold. I know you think you're protecting Ada, but you're not doing her any favors. She's getting worse, and you're in denial about it. The best thing for everyone would be if you both moved into assisted living voluntarily. If you fight this, it's just going to be harder on everyone, especially Randall. Harold's voice came through the speaker, tired and strained. Ada is fine, Emery. Her doctor says she's perfectly healthy for her age. Her doctor doesn't see her every day. Emery's recorded voice replied. I do. I see the confusion, the memory lapses, the way she can't keep track of simple things anymore. And frankly, you're not much better. How long do you think you can keep pretending that everything is normal? There was a pause, then Harold's voice again. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you stop being stubborn and start thinking about what's best for your family. Randall is killing himself trying to support you financially while you live in this fantasy where you're still independent. The house needs work you can't afford, your medical bills are piling up, and your income isn't enough to cover your expenses. You're becoming a burden, Harold, and the longer you deny it, the worse it's going to get. Harold stopped the recording. The silence that followed was profound, as if the very air in the room had been sucked away. Randall was staring at the recorder as if it were a poisonous snake. You told me they asked for help, he said, his voice barely audible. You said they came to us because they realized they couldn't manage anymore. Emery's composure finally shattered completely. I was protecting you, she screamed. They were never going to admit they needed help. They would have kept struggling and pretending everything was fine until one of them ended up in the hospital or dead. I was trying to solve the problem before it became a crisis. By lying to me, Randall's voice was getting louder. By manipulating me into thinking my parents were incompetent when they're perfectly fine? They're not fine, Emery shot back. Look at them. They're old, they're poor, and they're going to need care eventually. I was just trying to plan ahead. Harold stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. Emery, he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. You have been emotionally abusing my wife for months. You have been lying to my son about our health and our finances. You have been manipulating our family relationships for your own benefit. He paused, letting the words sink in. But most importantly, you have been trying to steal our home and our independence based on lies and fabricated evidence. Emery's face twisted with rage. Steal? I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was trying to help. Help yourself, I said, surprising everyone, including myself, with the strength in my voice. Help yourself to our house, our money, our son's loyalty. Help yourself to control over our lives. I stood up, my legs shaking but my resolve solid. You made me doubt my own mind, Emery. You made me think I was losing my memory, becoming a burden, falling apart. You isolated me from my friends and convinced my son that I was incompetent. Tears were streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of rage, of relief, of the terrible joy that comes with finally seeing the truth clearly after months of confusion and doubt. But worst of all, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, you tried to destroy my relationship with my son. You tried to make him see us as problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. The room fell silent except for the sound of my own breathing. Randall was staring at his wife as if he had never seen her before, and perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps none of us had ever really seen Emery clearly until this moment. Harold reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. The question now, he said, looking directly at Randall, is what are you going to do about it? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. Randall stood frozen in the middle of our kitchen, his face cycling through emotions I could barely identify. Shock, betrayal, anger, confusion, and something that looked almost like grief. Emery was the first to break the silence, but when she spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the concerned daughter-in-law, the financial expert, the woman who claimed to have our best interests at heart. What remained was something colder, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. You think you're so clever, don't you, Harold? She said, her tone flat and venomous. You think your little notebook and your recordings prove something important, but all you've done is show how paranoid and manipulative you really are. She turned to Randall, her expression shifting to something that might have looked like vulnerability if I hadn't just heard the truth about her. Baby, can't you see what's happening here? They're trying to turn you against me because they can't stand that you chose me over them. Harold's grip on my hand tightened, but his voice remained calm. Randall, look at the evidence. The medical records, the bills, the recorded conversation. Don't let her manipulate you again. Manipulate? Emery laughed, but it sounded like glass breaking. I'm not the one who's been secretly recording private conversations and building some conspiracy theory about my own family. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior that proves my point about their mental state. I watched my son's face as she spoke, and I could see her words having an effect. Even after everything Harold had shown him, even after hearing the recording of her voice, part of Randall still wanted to believe his wife. Part of him still wanted to find a way to make this all make sense without having to accept that the woman he loved had been systematically destroying his family. The bills are real, Emery, Randall said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad has the actual medical records, which could be falsified, she shot back. Has it occurred to you that someone with declining mental faculties might not be the most reliable source of information? That maybe Harold has been confused about what bills belong to what services. She was doing it again, right in front of us, trying to make us doubt reality. But this time, I wasn't going to let it happen. "Show him the bank statements," I said to Harold. Harold nodded and reached into his envelope once more. "I thought you might try this approach," he said to Emery, so I also obtained copies of all our bank statements for the past year. He laid out several pages of financial records. "These show exactly what was actually charged to our accounts, when, and by whom. There are no $8,000 medical bills, no $3,000 furnace repairs, no $5,000 roof replacements." Randall leaned forward, studying the bank statements with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that would determine his entire future. I could see him tracing the charges with his finger, cross-referencing them with the fabricated bills Emery had shown him over the months. "But I've seen the bills," he said slowly. "You've shown them to me, Emery. I've seen the invoices, the payment demands." "And where are those bills now?" Harold asked quietly. Randall looked around as if he expected to see them materialize out of thin air. "There. Emery handles all of that. She keeps track of your financial situation so I don't have to worry about the details." "Though, how convenient," Harold said. "And have you ever seen the actual medical records? Have you ever spoken directly to any of Ada's doctors about her supposed cognitive decline?" The color drained from Randall's face as he realized the answer to that question. "Emery said it would be easier if she handled all the medical communications. She said it was too stressful for you both to have to explain everything over and over." Harold nodded grimly. "Of course she did. Just like she suggested that our weekly dinners with the neighbors were too stressful for us. Just like she worried that church activities were too much for our health. Just like she convinced you that we needed to be protected from ourselves." Emery was backing toward the door now, but her retreat only seemed to make her more desperate and aggressive. "This is insane," she said. "You're making it sound like I orchestrated some elaborate conspiracy when all I did was try to help my husband's aging parents plan for their future." "By lying about their health?" Randall asked, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of real anger. "By facing reality," Emery snapped, "which is more than any of you seem capable of doing." Harold opened his notebook to a page near the end. "June 15th, he read. "Emery tells Randall that Ada had what appeared to be a mini-stroke while grocery shopping, becoming disoriented and needing assistance to get home." "I remember that day," I said, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. "I went shopping alone because Emery had canceled our usual trip together at the last minute. I had no problems whatsoever. I came home with groceries, put them away, and started dinner." "But you told me Mom was confused and scared," Randall said to Emery, his voice hollow. "You said she called you from the store parking lot crying because she couldn't remember how to get home." "I never called her," I said. "I don't even have her phone number memorized. I would have called you if I was in trouble." Emery's composure was cracking more obviously now. "You're all ganging up on me," she said. "This whole thing is a setup. You've been planning this ambush for weeks." "June 22nd, Harold continued reading. "Emery brings a brochure from Sunset Manor Assisted Living and suggests that we schedule a tour, claiming that Ada had expressed interest in learning more about their programs. I never expressed any such interest," I said. "In fact, when you showed me that brochure, I specifically said I wasn't ready to consider assisted living." "But you told me she was excited about the idea," Randall said to Emery. "You said she was relieved to finally have a plan for her future care." The lies were unraveling faster now, each revelation making the next one more obvious. I could see Randall struggling to reconcile the stories his wife had told him with the evidence his father was presenting. The cognitive dissonance was written all over his face. "July 1st, Harold read. "Emery tells you that Ada and I have agreed to begin the process of transferring the house deed and establishing power of attorney, and that we just need to schedule an appointment with a lawyer to make it official. We never agreed to any such thing," I said firmly. "We never even discussed it as a serious possibility." Randall turned to look at his wife, and I could see the exact moment when belief turned to doubt, when love began to war with evidence. "Emery," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you lie to me about all of this?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. She stood there by the door, her face cycling through expressions as she calculated her options. I could almost see her weighing the possibilities, trying to determine if there was still a way to salvage the situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was different again, stripped of pretense and filled with something that sounded almost like relief. "You want to know the truth, Randall? Fine. Here's the truth." She stepped back toward the table, her posture straightening as if she had made some fundamental decision about how this conversation was going to end. "Your parents are living in a house they can't afford, on an income that barely covers their basic needs, pretending that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. They're one medical emergency away from bankruptcy, one fall away from complete dependency, one crisis away from becoming completely your responsibility." Her voice was gaining strength as she spoke, as if she had been holding these words back for months and was finally free to say them. "So yes, I exaggerated their symptoms. Yes, I inflated their expenses. Yes, I created a sense of urgency about their situation that didn't exist yet. But I did it because someone needed to force all of you to face reality before it was too late." Harold was writing in his notebook again, documenting her confession with the same methodical care he had shown throughout this entire process. "You manipulated me," Randall said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe my parents were falling apart when they weren't. You made me treat them like children when they were perfectly capable of making their own decisions. I made you take responsibility," Emery shot back. "Something you never would have done if I had just told you the truth about their finances. You would have kept enabling their fantasy of independence until they ended up sick and broke and completely dependent on us. That wasn't your decision to make," I said, standing up from my chair. "Our lives, our choices, our future, that's ours to decide, not yours." Emery looked at me with undisguised contempt. "Really, Ada? And how's that working out for you? You're living month to month on Harold's reduced pension, watching your house fall apart around you, pretending that you're not scared about what happens when you can't take care of yourselves anymore." She turned back to Randall. "I was trying to solve a problem before it became a crisis. I was trying to protect our future, our financial security, our ability to help them without destroying ourselves in the process." "By lying to me," Randall repeated. "By making me think my mother was developing dementia when she wasn't. By fabricating medical bills and creating fake emergencies. By doing what needed to be done," Emery said, "because none of you had the courage to do it yourselves." The room fell silent again as we all processed her admission. She hadn't just confessed to lying, she had defended it. She wasn't apologetic or remorseful. She was angry that we had discovered her deception and frustrated that her plan hadn't worked. Harold closed his notebook and looked directly at Emery. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "Ada and I are facing financial challenges. Our income is limited, our house needs repairs, and we're certainly not wealthy people." He paused, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But we're not helpless children who need to be managed and manipulated. We're adults who have been making decisions for ourselves for decades. We have the right to face our challenges with dignity, to make our own choices about our future, and to ask for help when and if we decide we need it." He stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. "What we don't have is any obligation to surrender our independence, our assets, or our autonomy to someone who thinks lying and manipulation are acceptable ways to solve problems." Emery's face hardened. "Fine," she said. "Have it your way. Continue living in your little fantasy world where everything is going to magically work out, but don't expect us to keep subsidizing your delusions." She grabbed her purse from the counter and headed for the door. "When you end up in the hospital with no money and no plan, don't come crying to us for help. You've made your choice." But before she could reach the door, Harold spoke one more time. "Actually, Emery," he said, his voice calm and measured, "there's something else you should know before you leave. Something I haven't shared yet." She paused with her hand on the doorknob, and I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Ada and I may not be wealthy," Harold continued, "but we're not as helpless as you think we are. And we certainly don't need to surrender our independence to anyone who would rather lie to our family than respect our choices. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a second envelope, thicker than the first. You see, while you were busy fabricating crises and manipulating our son, I was busy making some phone calls of my own. The expression on Emery's face changed from anger to something that looked almost like fear. And in that moment, I realized that my husband's plan was far more comprehensive than I had imagined. Harold opened the second envelope with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout this entire confrontation. His movements were precise, controlled, like a surgeon making a critical incision. Emery stood frozen by the door, her hand still gripping the knob, but her attention completely focused on whatever my husband was about to reveal. 3 weeks ago, Harold began, pulling out a thick stack of official-looking documents. I contacted a lawyer, not to discuss power of attorney or property transfers, as you suggested we should, but to discuss something else entirely. He spread the first document on the table, and I could see it was some kind of legal letterhead. I wanted to understand exactly what constitutes elder abuse under Texas state law and what legal remedies are available to people in our situation. Emery's face went white. Elder abuse? Are you insane? I was trying to help you. Help us by lying about medical conditions? By fabricating bills? By isolating us from our friends and community? By manipulating our son into believing we were incompetent? Harold's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now that I had rarely heard in our 42 years of marriage. He pulled out another document. According to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, what you've been doing falls into several categories of elder abuse: psychological abuse through manipulation and threats, financial exploitation through fraudulent documentation, and neglect through deliberate interference with our medical care and social connections. Randall had been standing like a statue throughout this exchange, but now he moved toward the table, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. Dad, what are you saying exactly? Harold looked at his son with an expression of infinite sadness. I'm saying that your wife hasn't just been lying to you, Randall. She's been committing crimes against your mother and me. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Crimes. Not just manipulation or family drama, but actual criminal behavior. I felt my legs go weak, and I had to sit down heavily in my chair. The fabricated medical bills alone constitute fraud, Harold continued, pulling out more documents. But when you combine that with the systematic campaign to convince you that we were mentally incompetent, when you add in the attempts to gain control of our property and finances through deception, you're looking at a pattern of criminal elder abuse that could result in serious legal consequences. Emery finally let go of the doorknob and spun around to face us, her composure completely shattered. You can't be serious. You're going to involve the police? Over family disagreements? Family disagreements? I found my voice at last, surprised by how steady it sounded. You made me think I was losing my mind, Emery. You convinced my son that I was developing dementia when I wasn't. You fabricated medical emergencies and financial crises to manipulate us into giving up our independence. Harold nodded and pulled out another set of documents. I also contacted the billing departments of every medical provider and service company whose names appeared on the fraudulent bills you created. They've all confirmed that the charges were never made to our accounts and have provided sworn statements to that effect. He laid out several official letters on the table. Dr. Morrison's office, the emergency room at Methodist Hospital, the physical therapy clinic on Elm Street, the medical equipment company on Fifth Avenue. All of them have provided documentation proving that the bills you showed Randall were completely fabricated. Randall was reading the statements with the intensity of a man trying to understand how his entire world had been built on lies. But why? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. Why would you do this, Emery? What did you hope to gain? For the first time since this confrontation began, Emery seemed to deflate. The anger and defiance drained out of her, leaving behind something smaller and more desperate. I wanted us to have a future, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea what it costs to take care of aging parents? Do you know what happens to families when they have to choose between their own financial security and their parents' care? She moved away from the door and back toward the table, but her movements were different now, less predatory and more pleading. My own parents went through this with my grandparents. They spent their entire retirement savings on nursing home care, lost their house, ended up living in a tiny apartment with nothing left for their own future. Harold was still writing in his notebook, documenting every word of her confession. I wasn't going to let that happen to us, Emery continued. I wasn't going to watch you bankrupt yourself trying to support them when there were other options available. Better options. Better for whom? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Better for everyone, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. If they moved into assisted living voluntarily, while they were still healthy enough to adjust, they would have been happier. The financial burden would have been manageable, and we could have preserved our own future while still making sure they were cared for. Randall set down the legal documents and stared at his wife as if he had never seen her before. So you decided to force the situation by making them think they had no choice. I decided to face reality before it was too late, she said. Someone had to be the adult in this situation. Harold closed his notebook and looked directly at Emery. The adult thing to do would have been to have an honest conversation about concerns and options. The adult thing to do would have been to respect our autonomy and our right to make our own decisions about our future. He paused, his gaze steady and unwavering. What you did was criminal, Emery. And the question now is what we're going to do about it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences in this conversation. This one felt final, like the moment before a verdict is announced in a courtroom. What are you saying? Emery asked, though I could see in her eyes that she already knew. Harold pulled out one final document from the envelope. This is a complaint form for the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. It documents everything you've done over the past 8 months, supported by the evidence we've gathered. He set it on the table next to all the other papers: medical records, bank statements, fraudulent bills, legal opinions, and sworn statements, the accumulated evidence of months of systematic abuse and manipulation. I haven't filed it yet, Harold said quietly. I wanted to give you the opportunity to understand exactly what you've done and what the consequences could be before I decided how to proceed. Emery stared at the complaint form as if it were a venomous snake. You would really destroy your son's marriage over this? You destroyed my son's marriage? Harold replied. By lying to him, by manipulating him, by using him as a weapon against his own parents. We're just deciding whether to let you face the legal consequences for your actions. Randall had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward. His face was pale, but his expression was resolute. What would happen if you filed that complaint? Harold looked at his son with infinite sadness. There would be an investigation. Emery could face criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. If convicted, she could face significant fines and potentially jail time. The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the weight of this information. I found myself thinking about how we had gotten to this point, how a woman I had welcomed into our family with love and hope had systematically worked to destroy our relationships and steal our independence. There's something else, Harold said, reaching into the envelope one more time. Something I discovered while I was gathering all this evidence. He pulled out a bank statement, but this one wasn't ours. This is a statement from an account Emery opened 6 months ago, apparently in preparation for managing our finances once she gained power of attorney. Randall leaned forward to look at the statement, and I saw his face change as he read it. There's money in this account, he said slowly. A lot of money. Harold nodded grimly. Nearly $15,000, transferred from various sources over the past 6 months. Money that was supposedly going to pay for our increased expenses and medical bills. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Emery been lying about our expenses and medical conditions, she had been collecting money from Randall based on those lies, and storing it in an account we knew nothing about. You were stealing from us, Randall said, his voice hollow with disbelief. You were taking money from me based on fake bills and keeping it for yourself. Emery's remaining composure cracked completely. It wasn't stealing, she said desperately. It was planning. I was setting money aside for their future care, for when they really would need it. In an account only you controlled, Harold pointed out, without our knowledge or consent. With money you obtained through fraud, I added, my voice stronger now as the full scope of her betrayal became clear. Randall sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. How could I have been so blind? He asked, more to himself than to anyone else. How could I have believed all of this without questioning any of it? Because you trusted your wife, Harold said gently. Because you believed that someone who claimed to love you wouldn't systematically lie to you. Because you're a good man who wants to take care of his family, and she exploited that goodness for her own purposes. Emery was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and anger at being caught, at seeing her carefully constructed plan falling apart. You don't understand, she sobbed. I was trying to protect our future. I was trying to make sure we would be okay when this situation inevitably became a crisis. What? By creating a crisis that didn't exist, I said. By stealing our dignity, our independence, and our relationship with our son. Harold picked up the complaint form and held it in his hands, weighing it like he was weighing our entire future. Emery, he said finally, you have 30 seconds to convince me why I shouldn't file this complaint today. The challenge hung in the air between them, a final test of whether there was any possibility of redemption, any chance that the woman who had systematically abused and manipulated us might still have enough humanity left to do the right thing. Emery looked around the room, her eyes darting from Harold's face to mine to Randall's, searching for any sign of weakness or sympathy she could exploit. But for the first time in months, she found none. She began, then stopped. I can't, she whispered finally. And in that moment, I knew that Harold's plan was about to reach its conclusion. 5 months later, I was standing in the garden behind our house, watching Harold plant tomatoes in the raised beds he had built last month. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I could hear the sound of children playing in the neighborhood where we had raised our son, where we had built our life together, and where we would continue to live with dignity and independence for as long as we chose. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After Emery's confession that day, after Harold laid out all the evidence of her systematic manipulation and abuse, the path forward had been both clear and difficult. Harold had filed the complaint with Adult Protective Services, just as he had said he would. The investigation that followed had confirmed everything we suspected and more. Emery was charged with multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received 3 years probation, community service, and an order to repay the money she had stolen, plus damages. But the legal resolution, while important, had been the easy part. Rebuilding our relationship with Randall, helping him process the betrayal he had experienced, and learning to trust each other again had been much more challenging. For the first month after the confrontation, Randall had barely spoken to us. He was consumed with guilt and shame about how he had treated us, angry at himself for believing Emery's lies, and struggling to understand how he could have been so thoroughly manipulated by someone he loved. I remembered the afternoon he had finally come to see us, about 6 weeks after Emery had moved out of their house. He had sat in our living room, his head in his hands, and cried like the little boy who used to run to us during thunderstorms. I don't know how to apologize for this, he had said, his voice muffled by his hands. I don't know how to make up for the way I treated you both. Harold had sat beside him on the couch, the same couch where he had read bedtime stories when Randall was small, and put his arm around his son's shoulders. You don't need to apologize for being manipulated, Harold had said gently. You need to learn from it, and you need to help us rebuild what was damaged. But you don't need to carry guilt for someone else's crimes. It had taken time, patience, and several sessions with a family counselor, but slowly we had found our way back to each other. Randall had learned to recognize the signs of manipulation that he had missed before. We had learned to trust his intentions even when we disagreed with his decisions. And together, we had built a new relationship based on honesty, respect, and mutual support, rather than obligation and guilt. The financial situation that Emery had fabricated as a crisis had turned out to be manageable with honest communication and realistic planning. Yes, we lived on a fixed income. Yes, our house needed some repairs. Yes, we would eventually face health challenges that might require us to make difficult decisions about our future. But we were facing these realities together, as a family, with full knowledge of the facts and respect for each other's autonomy. Randall helped us create a realistic budget and plan for potential future needs. We made some modifications to the house to improve safety and accessibility, and we established clear agreements about when and how we would ask for help if we needed it. Most importantly, we had reclaimed our voices in our own lives. No one was making decisions for us based on fabricated emergencies or exaggerated fears. No one was isolating us from our friends and community. No one was trying to convince us that we were incompetent or burdensome. I had reconnected with my old friends, including Mrs. Kowalski next door, who had been wondering why we had become so distant over the past year. I had resumed my volunteer work at the church, which I had missed more than I realized. Harold had started a woodworking class at the community center and was making friends with other retirees who shared his interests. We were living our lives again, making our own choices, facing our challenges with dignity and support, rather than manipulation and fear. "Ada," Harold called from the garden, interrupting my thoughts. "Could you bring me the watering can from the garage?" I smiled and went to fetch it, marveling at how such a simple request felt like a gift after months of having every interaction filtered through Emery's agenda of crisis and control. As I handed Harold the watering can, he straightened up and looked at me with the same steady gaze that had sustained me through 42 years of marriage and the recent months of upheaval. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. The past year had been one of the most difficult and painful periods of our lives together. We had been betrayed by someone we trusted, manipulated into doubting ourselves and each other, and forced to confront the possibility that our own son might choose his wife's lies over our truth. But we had also discovered strengths we didn't know we had. Harold's quiet determination to document the truth and protect our family had been remarkable. My own ability to reclaim my voice and stand up for our rights had surprised me. And Randall's willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful, and work to rebuild our relationship had shown us the kind of man we had really raised. "No regrets about standing up for ourselves," I said finally. "No regrets about refusing to be victims. No regrets about fighting for our right to live with dignity." Harold nodded and turned back to his tomato plants, but I could see the satisfaction in his expression. Just then, we heard the sound of a car pulling into our driveway. I looked toward the house and saw Randall getting out of his truck, carrying what looked like a toolbox. "What's he doing here?" I asked, though I was smiling. "I may have mentioned that the kitchen faucet has been dripping," Harold said with studied innocence. Randall approached us with the slightly tentative manner he still sometimes displayed when he wasn't sure if he was intruding. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, and he was slowly learning to rebuild his life without Emery's constant manipulation and control. "Hey, Mom, Dad," he said, setting down his toolbox. "I thought I'd take a look at that faucet, if that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said, reaching up to hug my son. "But you don't have to fix everything that needs fixing around here. We can afford to call a plumber if necessary." Randall smiled, and for the first time in months it reached his eyes. "I know you can, but I want to help. Is that okay?" The difference was subtle but crucial. He wasn't helping because we were incompetent and needed to be managed. He wasn't helping because someone had convinced him we were in crisis. He was helping because he loved us, and because helping family members is what people do for each other. "It's more than okay," Harold said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "It's appreciated." As Randall headed toward the house to work on the faucet, Harold and I continued tending the garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard where Randall had played as a child, where we had hosted countless family barbecues and birthday parties, where we had built a life together that no amount of manipulation or abuse could ultimately destroy. "You know," I said, pulling weeds from around the pepper plants, "I used to be afraid that we were becoming a burden, that we were holding Randall back from his own life and happiness." Harold paused in his watering to look at me. "And now?" Now I realize that was never really the issue. The issue was whether we would be allowed to age with dignity and make our own choices about our future, or whether someone else would make those choices for us based on their own agenda. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands, and looked around at our modest but well-maintained home, our thriving garden, our neighborhood full of friends and memories. We may not be wealthy, and we may not live forever, but we're not a burden. We're a family, and families support each other through challenges without lies, manipulation, or force. Harold set down the watering can and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine just as they had on our wedding day 42 years ago. "Emery was wrong about a lot of things," he said quietly. "But she was especially wrong about one thing. She thought that love meant controlling people, protecting them from their own choices, making decisions for them based on what you think is best for them." He paused, looking toward the house where we could hear Randall working on the faucet, whistling softly as he worked. "But real love means respecting people enough to let them live their own lives, make their own mistakes, and ask for help when they're ready. It means being there to support them when they need it, not forcing support on them when they don't." As if summoned by our conversation, Randall appeared at the back door. "Faucet's fixed," he called out, and I noticed the front steps could use some reinforcement. "Want me to take a look at that next weekend?" "If you have time and want to," I called back, "but only if it works for your schedule." He grinned and gave us a thumbs up before disappearing back into the house. Harold squeezed my hand gently. "Think he's learned the difference between helping and controlling?" I watched our son through the kitchen window as he cleaned up his tools, moving with the confident ease of a man who was rebuilding his life on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation. "I think we all have," I said. As the sun set behind our house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace that had been missing from my life for far too long. We had faced a serious threat to our independence, our dignity, and our family relationships. We had been lied to, manipulated, and abused by someone we had trusted and welcomed into our lives. But we had survived. More than survived, we had reclaimed our voices, our choices, and our right to live our lives according to our own values and decisions. The future might still hold challenges. We were, after all, in our 60s and 70s, and time brings changes whether we're ready for them or not. But whatever came next, we would face it together, with honesty and mutual respect, as partners in life rather than problems to be managed. And that, I thought as I watched Harold put away the gardening tools and Randall lock up his toolbox, was the way it should be, the way it had always been meant to be. Some people might look at our story and see it as a cautionary tale about the importance of watching out for elder abuse and manipulation. Others might see it as a reminder that family relationships require constant vigilance and clear boundaries. But for me, it was something simpler and more fundamental. It was proof that you're never too old to stand up for yourself, never too vulnerable to reclaim your dignity, and never too late to rebuild relationships on a foundation of truth rather than lies. Harold had been right to document everything, right to gather evidence, right to confront the truth no matter how painful it was. But most importantly, he had been right to believe that our family was worth fighting for, that our relationship with our son could survive the damage that had been done to it, and that love based on respect and honesty was stronger than manipulation based on fear and control. As we walked back toward the house together, our hands still intertwined, I felt grateful for many things. Grateful for a husband who had protected our family with patience and wisdom. Grateful for a son who had found the courage to face the truth and work to rebuild what had been damaged. Grateful for friends and community members who had welcomed us back without judgment or questions. But most of all, I felt grateful for the simple, profound gift of being able to live my own life, make my own choices, and face my own future with dignity and tact. That was what Emery had tried to take from us, and that was what we had refused to give up. And in the end, that had made all the difference. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.